Hi, I'm Hanne Nielsen from the University of Tasmania,
And I'm Jasmine Lee from the Australian Antarctic Division and University of Queensland.
and today we're taking you to destination Antarctica. Now, when you think of Antarctica and animals, these might be the sort of creatures that spring to mind. But what about those animals that have headed south with humans, making possible the exploration of Antarctica? And what of the creatures that are deemed to be alien and not to belong in the far south? Tracing the history of animals that have been transported to Antarctica via human vectors reveals much about the geopolitics of the region. It highlights how human attitudes towards Antarctica have shifted and how the complex human and non-human relations that happen on the ground in Antarctica have evolved in response. So this presentation today uses animal journeys to the far south to explore ideas of discovery, territorial claims, wilderness, scientific findings and protection, and it puts those non-human animals at the centre of a very human history of relationships with the continent. Now, humans have travelled to Antarctica for a range of species as well. The very first interactions, particularly on the subantarctic islands, were because of commercial reasons, sealers and whalers heading down in search of blubber and fur. And that's not the focus of this talk today. But it's also worth keeping in mind that early Antarctic discovery and exploration was very anthropocentric and had a rather different approach to the whole ecosystem view to Antarctica we tend to come across in the scientific approaches of today. But today, of course, we're looking at transfers in the other direction, from home to Antarctica. And various animals played a pivotal role in the success of the first land-based expeditions in Antarctica. And the labour of those animals depended on what needed to be done. Mostly they helped with towing sledges. Dogs, for instance, famously helping Roald Amundsen and his team become the first to reach 90 degrees south in the summer of 1911. That technique of dog sledding was something developed by indigenous people in the Arctic, then put to use in the south. And ponies also, another species taken to Antarctica in the early 1900s, used by the likes of Ernest Shackleton and Robert Falcon Scott in place of dogs. Again, they were used often up in Siberia, and because of that, chosen to be taken down into that frozen and hostile environment. So animals could be, in this case, workers. Animals were also taken south as a source of food. The Port Lockroy pig in this 1940s image is a case in point. So she was sent down as a source of food. The men did know her fate. They called her the pig, but they did become quite attached to her as well. So she became a companion as well as ultimately dinner. And Stephen Hattersley writes about the incident in his book Operation Tabarin and concludes that the men agreed that the mutton that arrived pre-prepared was far more preferable to this pork on the hoof. So here we have animals and food, and also an insight into animals as companions as well. There have been a few pets that are brought down specifically for companion purposes at various times. Animals as celebrities have also had a very important use in the Antarctic. So in 1933, the US Admiral Richard Byrd made dairy history by taking 3 golden Guernseys to his Little America base in the Ross Sea region. So those cows drew attention to the expedition, not least because of press releases, like this one here, from the American Guernsey Cattle Club, that's saying this 12,000-mile trip is the longest trip that any cows have ever taken since the well-known cow jumped over the moon. So they certainly had a reputation to live up to, and taking those dairy animals down ensured ongoing media attention, particularly as a calf was born en route to Antarctica. And that media attention also helped gain funds for the expedition, so very much tied in with commerce. These cattle here had another function, helping Byrd cast his base, or Little America, as very much an American space. So their presence was also a way of performing colonization on the ice and asserting a geopolitical interest in the continent. And this idea of geopolitics has been repeated in other instances too. So animals as geopolitical instruments is particularly clear on the subantarctic island of South Georgia. So these reindeer were introduced on 3 different occasions in the early 1900s. They were brought down to provide food, to provide sport for those to hunt them, and to remind the whalers working there of home up in the Northern Hemisphere. But they also helped Norway cement itself as a polar region, a polar nation, with capabilities to master the landscapes in both the north and in the south. So Peter Roberts and Dolly Jorgensen have written about the transfer of polar animals. There were also things like seals and penguins taken to the north. But they argue that transplanted animals may be conceived as geopolitical instruments, mastery over fauna as being a means of expressing mastery over space. So a successful transplantation of a species from one polar region to another signaled power over that natural landscape and also showcase technical and logistical ability on the part of the ones doing that particular transfer. And just because that transfer was seen as a success at the time doesn't mean it was seen that way forever though. And that's the case with the reindeer. They also cause ecological damage, trampling mosses, causing soil erosion, causing nest collapses of birds, reducing habitat for things like pintail duck. And they also got in the way of other eradications. So when they wanted to get rid of the rats down on South Georgia Island, they first needed to get rid of the largest species. And that was happening between 2013 and 2015 to allow that eradication to go ahead. And these stamps here are telling the story of that particular series of events. And here we see those attitudes really changing. So the animals themselves did nothing wrong. They were the result of many generations of herds. They were deliberately released, but they really raised the question of what does belong and who gets to decide that belongs, these very ethical questions. And it's particularly pertinent when the area in question has a young human history, so somewhere like Antarctica. So what led us to the point of deciding certain creatures belong in these Antarctic and subantarctic regions while others don't? Well, in Antarctica, it's important to understand the political context. The Antarctic Treaty was signed in 1959. What that did was set Antarctica aside as a place for peace and science is the primary activity that happens down there these days. But there have been a number of annexes and instruments added in response to concerns over the use of marine living resources. And throughout the 1980s, there was a very big push for greater environmental protection, happening alongside discussions over the regulation of mining activity. Also push for a possible world park and Greenpeace setting up World Park Base. So we had these shifts in attitude back home, particularly places like Australia and France, which meant that these discussions around mining didn't end up going ahead. Instead, we had the formation of the Environmental Protocol to the Antarctic Treaty, which was signed in 1991. So these days, it's the Madrid Protocol that prevents the introduction of non-native species to Antarctica. It had a huge impact on the practical ways humans and non-humans interact in the far south. Dogs were removed by April 1994. There were permits required to bring any plants or animals in. No live food to be brought down. A lot of care taken with poultry to prevent the spread of avian disease. And that's the reason that we no longer have, for instance, sled dogs down in Antarctica, why you can't take a tropical fish to winter over if you're heading down there. But thinking of Antarctica as a place to protect in this way really is a relatively recent way of framing the continent. That question of what belongs where, and what happens when humans as a vector for animal movement to the Antarctic cease to be seen as a positive and is characterized as something that must be prevented at all costs. Well, to address that, we'll pass over to Jasmine.
So this reframing of Antarctica as a fragile wilderness and a shift in this global attitude contributed to a rise in biological research and recognition of the importance of Antarctic species and ecosystems. So whilst once thought of as a barren wasteland, it became clear that Antarctica is actually home to many unique and extremely well-adapted species that are found nowhere else in the world. And so you might think that obviously of Antarctica is this land of ice and snow, and that is not suitable habitat for native species. So the majority of these terrestrial species survive in the less than 1% of Antarctica that is permanently ice-free. So there are small patches of rock outcrop that emerge up through the ice and snow, kind of analogous to islands in the ocean. So these suitable habitat patches occur as ice-free cliffs, mountain tops, fell fields, dry valleys and coastal oases, like this dry valley here. So as you can see around the continent, the ice-free areas are mostly situated around the coastlines, but they also run through the middle through the Transantarctic Mountains there. So when we're talking about terrestrial Antarctic biodiversity, we're not just talking about everyone's favourite penguins. There's also hardy moths and lichens, microbes, breeding seals and other seabirds, 2 flowering plants and many invertebrates, including nematodes, tardigrades, springtails, mites and rotifers. Each of these species is highly adapted to be able to survive in the extreme Antarctic conditions, including low levels of sunlight during winter and overexposure during summer, limiting nutrients, temperature extremes, and a vicious freeze-thaw cycle, and most importantly, a lack of available water. So, many species have unique adaptations. For example, some invertebrates adapt using forms of cryptobiosis, such as this tardigrade here on the left. It allows them to shut down their metabolism and desiccate whilst conditions are limiting. So this is similar to a bear hibernating through winter. Mosses are also able to desiccate when there is no water available, and some can produce sunscreens to protect themselves from excessive UV. So these are just some examples of the amazing adaptations Antarctic species host. And so the extreme conditions that produce these adaptations, as well as Antarctica's isolation, has resulted in high numbers of endemic species found on the continent, some of which have survived multiple interglacial cycles, and they're found nowhere else on the planet. Many are also isolated from each other in the ice-free area islands, so unable to cross these vast ice and snow barriers. Increasing understanding of this endemism and the segregation of species led to hypotheses regarding the spatial distribution of biodiversity and potentially unique groups in different regions of Antarctica. So in 2007, we had our first split where Chan and Convey divided the continent into 2 broad regions, the Maritime Antarctic and Continental Antarctica, separated by the Gresset Line, which is analogous to the Wallace Line found between Asia and Australia. So, and in 2012 and updated in 2016, we had our most recent regionalisation, where Alex Terauds and colleagues produced the Antarctic Conservation Biogeographic Regions, or ACBRs, which divide Antarctica into 16 bioregions based on biodiversity and environmental data. So these ACBRs were endorsed by the Committee of Environmental Protection, which was established by the Environment Protocol to help protect the Antarctic environment. So they've been widely used by a scientific community, and so they represent these sets of unique sets of species found on the Antarctic continent. So as our understanding of Antarctic biodiversity grew, so did our understanding of the threatening processes placing them at risk. Not the totally isolated and barren wasteland we once thought. We now know that climate change, pollution, increasing human activity, and invasive species are all impacting on Antarctic biodiversity. Science and tourist activity has rapidly grown in the last few decades, with over 50,000 tourists visiting the continent in the last season, and new stations and facilities built almost every year. With increasing human visitation comes increasing pollution in the forms of emissions, environmental incidences such as fuel spills, human waste, noise pollution, and litter. Non-native or alien species have been recognised as one of the greatest threats to native biodiversity, where the generalist natures and life history traits of some alien species may allow them to outcompete specialist Antarctic species, which have long evolved in isolated conditions without that high level of competition. So the Committee for Environmental Protection and the Environment Protocol defined non-native species as an organism occurring outside its natural past or present range and dispersal potential, whose presence and dispersal in any biogeographic zone of the Antarctic Treaty Area is due to unintentional human action. So this is everything that we have introduced to Antarctica. So over 35 of these non-native species have already been recorded on the continent, including that of the invasive Poa annua, which is a globally invasive species that has established itself in many places, such as subantarctic Macquarie Island, as you can see here. Whilst we do not yet have a thorough understanding of how many non-native species will impact on Antarctic species, if the subantarctic provides any indication, then the outlook is bleak. Antarctica's isolation and extreme climate have helped to keep non-native species at bay in recent decades. However, as climate warms, it will become easier and easier for non-native species to establish and survive on the continent. Indeed, climate change will also exacerbate other threatening processes, such as increasing opportunities for tourism, and it will directly threaten Antarctic ecosystems by changing temperature precipitation regimes, impacting sea levels, and increasing the amount of ice-free area available to both native and non-native species. So humans are the primary vector for transporting non-native species to the continent. Whilst this was once purposeful with companion and comfort animals, it is now largely accidental, with non-native plants and invertebrates stowing away on ships and planes and in cargo, clothing and equipment. This realization led to an ever-growing interest in biosecurity. Annex 2 of the Environment Protocol is dedicated purely to non-native species and declares that no non-native species shall be taken to the continent and all known non-native species will be removed. So this brought about a substantial change in science practices and our biosecurity protocols, signifying the end of an era and a shift toward a more environmentally focused scientific program. Biosecurity concerns relate not just to intercontinental transfer of non-native species to Antarctica, but also to the transfer of both native and non-native species between biogeographic regions. Given the distinct regionalization of Antarctic biodiversity, it is possible that the movement and establishment of both native and non-native species between regions will lead to homogenization of Antarctica's unique species and a loss of diversity across the continent. As well as increasing biosecurity and monitoring, the Antarctic Treaty System and national Antarctic programs have an array of tools at hand for protecting Antarctic biodiversity. Foremost amongst these is the ability to designate Antarctic Specially Protected Areas, or ASPAs, and Antarctic Specially Managed Areas that can be used to protect and produce guidelines for access to particularly valuable or vulnerable sites. Somewhat like red listing, species can also be used to designate vulnerable species as specially protected species. And sharing this knowledge amongst national programs will be essential for forming cohesive strategies to address threats and reduce risks, such as those of invasive species on the continent. So the Committee for Environmental Protection plays a chief role by supporting research on and producing guidelines for human activity, infrastructure, transport and biosecurity. Indeed, to help parties reduce the risk of introducing non-native species, they produced a manual on invasive species in 2011 and updated in 2016. It aims to help protect Antarctic biodiversity and intrinsic values by preventing the unintended introduction to the Antarctic region of species not native to that region, and also the movement of species within Antarctica from one biogeographic zone to another. The CEP has also labelled research and action targeted at invasive species, climate change and human activity as Priority 1 issues in their recent 5-year work plan. As climate change progresses and human activity continues to grow, it will be essential for the CEP to work with the tourist industry and national programs to maximise conservation outcomes for the region.
So our attitudes and our actions towards Antarctica have changed substantially in the past 200 years, and undoubtedly those will continue to shift. Jeffrey Jerome Cohen and Lyle Duckett argue that to think that the world is ours to ruin or to save are two expressions of the same hubris. Both frames do view humans as the only beings with agency over the future of the planet Earth, but the two approaches sanction very different activities in the Antarctic. So attitudes towards non-human animals in the far south are revealing of shifting attitudes toward the region as a whole. Once a place to be explored and celebrated for instrumental value, today Antarctica is seen as a place to protect, with those intrinsic values also enshrined in the Madrid Protocol. But that protection is not inevitable, and neither is it guaranteed to be effective, as illustrated by the challenges of species on the move. So the relationship between humans and non-human animals in and around the Antarctic is complex, it's value-laden, it has parallels in many other places. As the examples we've shown have demonstrated, the ends of the earth are not immune to conversations about aliens, natives, and what belongs where. So the far south is not as remote as it might first seem.
Antarctica is globally important, not only because of its unique biodiversity, but also because it is essential for regulating the global climate. Yet, it is a changing habitat, shifting both physically and in terms of our perceptions. The journeys of species in and to the Antarctic continues and must be carefully considered from a range of angles, including biogeographic regions, geopolitical decisions, environmental change, and cultural context. So we'd just like to thank you for listening to our presentation, Destination Antarctica, and if you have any questions, fire them away.